Okay, so it's time for a film review. And as I say with all my reviews, there will be spoilers in this. So I will be discussing details of the film. The film I'm going to talk about is Pierrepoint. That's the DVD cover, Pierrepoint. It's a British film released in 2005 to the international audience, and it actually began as a television film. It's directed by Adrian Shergold, and he actually has no Wikipedia article, so I haven't seen any of his other credits. Produced by Christine Langan, and it stars Timothy Spall in the title role, also Juliet Stevenson and Eddie Marzan. So, Pierpoint, it's basically the story of Britain's last hangman, and it's a very unorthodox film. I would say it's quite widely acclaimed because it was shortlisted for, among other things, the Toronto Film Festival, the Glasgow Film Festival, the Dublin International Film Festival, and Human Rights Watch. Actually, I wasn't aware of that until literally just now. Only bought this DVD today, actually. Um, so this is a very unorthodox film subject. There's been many films made about crimes and about murderers, and even featuring executions. There haven't been that many films focusing on the executioner. The only other one I can think of is The Green Mile, which of course is fictional. Um, Now Albert Pierrepoint was famous, of course, for being Britain's last hangman, and he's somewhat an ambiguous character. It is, I think, necessary to give a bit of the history before continuing with my review of the film. Um, Pierpoint operated between 1932 and 1956. Um, so it's not quite true, this epithet of Britain's last hangman, as that's how the film was marketed in North America, because Britain's last executions were 1964. He resigned or stepped down. His name was basically taken off the Home Office list on his request in 1956. So technically, he wasn't Britain's last hangman. I'm not sure who was actually, but he was one of the last, and he was almost certainly the most prolific. No one knows for sure, but Pierpoint executed anywhere from 430 to 680 people, including over 200 German war criminals. And among the famous cases, or among the famous people that he sent to death, was Gordon Cummins, the so-called Blackout Ripper, John George Haig, the acid bath murderer, Derek Bentley, Irma Grese, who was the so-called Angel of Belsen. She was the youngest of the Nazi war criminals to be executed. Ruth Ellis, the last woman in Britain to be executed in 1955. Um, Lord Haw Haw, John Amory, who were both executed as traitors. In fact, Pierpoint described Amory as the bravest man he ever met, and there's differing accounts as to that execution. Some say that he got into a full length conversation with Amory. Others say that Amory exchanged a greeting of, "Oh, Pierpoint, good to see you," but not under these circumstances. But that's been disputed. And August Sangrit, and there's several other notable cases. John Evans, Timothy John Evans, whose case is widely seen as a miscarriage of justice today. Indeed, Ruth Ellis was also under very controversial circumstances. The film has a few inconsistencies. For example, in terms of the chronology, there's some executions depicted as being a little bit later than they actually were. For example, Dorothea Waddingham was executed in 1936 in a film that depicts her execution as being in the war years. So there's a few slight historical inaccuracies. One of those he executed was James Inglis, 7 Seconds, Manchester Strangeways Prison, 1951. That's actually a record in British judicial history and quite possibly in world history. 7 seconds. Um, Now, Pierpoint, like I say, was a very ambiguous character. This is the real Pierpoint, and it's from a book called Londoners Through a Lens. Actually, Pierrepoint was from Bradford. That's where he was born. But this is the man himself, Albert Pierrepoint. So you see there, he's sort of quite I wouldn't say frail, but quite a thin man. So slight difference between him and Timothy Spaulding. Although I think Spaulding is a superb actor, and I really think he was perfect at that role because he's often got sort of kind of dark gothic roles, and I can't think of a darker film than this. Um, the thing about Pierrepoint, it is not a feel good film in any possible way, but it is definitely a thought provoking film. And for someone like me who is an opponent of the death penalty, broadly speaking, um, what I like about this film is that it's not black and white. The film, in my opinion, doesn't politicize the issue to a point where it's kind of forcing its opinion on you. Like I said, it's directed by Adrian Shergold. I don't know what his own view on the matter is, but the film's clever in this way because it really, really does show sentiments on both sides. And an interesting thing about the film is that it shows the changing public attitudes. In the early parts of the film, the 30s and the 40s, it's showing widespread, more or less, support for Pierrepoint to the point whereby even after the Nuremberg trials, he was even treated as something of a celebrity. People bought him drinks in his local pub and so on, to which the man himself was very uncomfortable. But by the 1950s, by the late 50s, it was becoming controversial, and it shows, I forget her name, but a prominent abolitionist sort of stirring up the crowd against Albert Pierrepoint, and even at one point his car is attacked by a mob. Um, there's some very, very moving parts in the film. For example, there's one scene where a mother comes to his house and actually pleads with him to spare her son's life because she's found out that he would be the executioner, and he has to just pretend he doesn't know what she's talking about. Um, there's a lot of moving moments in the film, and I think it really shows the character of this man. Based on all the accounts I've read, the thing about Pierrepoint is, on one hand, this is a man who basically killed hundreds of people. On the other hand, he it's very, very difficult to work out Pierrepoint's character because on one hand he almost boasted about his record, and he came from a family of executioners. His father and uncle had both been executioners as well. Um, so on one hand, you could say it's almost sadistic boasting about that, but on the other hand, you could argue that the speed factor was more humane. So maybe it wasn't gloating, maybe it was the fact he was proud that he'd done it in a professional manner. You know, this was a time when Britain had the death penalty. It was the law of the land, and he made it as professional and as humane as he possibly could under the circumstances. There are moving parts and moments in the film. For example, there's a character called Tish, and this was based on a real case. I believe the man's name was James or John Corbett. Basically, he killed his lover. Now, the significant thing about this is in his local pub, Pierrepoint basically was a close acquaintance of this man, and they kind of had this double act where he was called Tosh and the guy was called Tish. So they kind of had a double act to entertain the locals. Um, but he in the film it shows the young woman who Tish has a relationship with, and there's one scene where her new lover gets into basically humiliates Tish by punching him in the pub, and he's depicted as quite a weak character in some ways, but there's obviously growing tensions here, and it's a very dramatic scene. He just basically says, "I'm sorry, Tosh," and that's it. And then he's given sort of his roll call of the next execution, and he never knew the man's real name. He goes to the prison. I think it's Strange Ways in Manchester again, and he hears the singing and he recognizes it's his acquaintance. So throughout the film, he has to take on this meticulous, sort of cold, robotic professional approach to this. He doesn't get personal with the inmates at all. He makes it as quick as possible, but in this case, you could tell it's starting to play on his mind because he knows the guy, and it's the only part of the film where he actually talks to the condemned. That's quite powerful. Um, During the Nuremberg war trials, he's with a young lieutenant who serves as his assistant, and the lieutenant's kind of pointing out the war criminals and saying, this person done this person done that, and Pierpoint kind of gets worked up and he says, we don't care what they've done, our job is to execute them, and he kind of takes this attitude that when they're executed, they've they're innocent, they've done the time or they've paid the price, now they're pure, now they're innocent. Spalding is excellent at this role. I haven't seen many interviews with the real Pierpoint, so I suppose I can't say for sure this is like how Pierpoint was, but I think Timothy Spalding's a great actor, and the fact they don't particularly look like each other doesn't really matter because Spalding is such a powerful character actor in this sense. But like I say, the film doesn't make any political statement because it also shows you could say that it's a lefty liberal film against the death penalty, but I don't think it is because it demonstrates, for example, the British attitude to the Nuremberg war trials was that the British were going to treat these people much better than the Nazis had treated their victims at Auschwitz and Belsen. So it is quite a clever film. This is not a film, in my opinion, that is politically biased, and I think that's very important given the nature of the film. Um, One bit towards the end is the execution of Ruth Ellis. In fact, that's possibly the most famous scene in the film, and they use it indeed for the cover. In Britain, that was a very notorious case because Ruth Ellis was basically a young woman, a socialite in London, and she murdered her lover. But it was widely believed that her lover had been abusive, and many people in Britain were quite sympathetic to her. And that was one of the major cases that basically ultimately led the British public to turn against the death penalty. Um, like I say, he was personally responsible for some of the most famous cases in this country. So it's a very interesting film. And it's like I said, I really don't think it's a film that forces its opinion on you. It is a provocative film, it's a moving film, and it's a powerful film. But I don't, in my opinion, it's not a biased film. Now, the thing about Pierpoint himself, and this is getting back to the history of it, and I think this is demonstrated in the film. The real Pierpoint had quite an ambiguous attitude towards the death penalty. It's widely said that in 1974, when he released his biography after years of being sort of introverted, that he argued that the death penalty was not a deterrent. So that sort of would indicate that he regretted his career and he became an abolitionist. Now, this is somewhat not the case. There's no evidence whatsoever that Albert Pierrepoint ever became an abolitionist. Um, and some even argued, one of his former assistants argued he only said that to sell the biography. Um, it's a bit difficult to see a man who executed over 600 people suddenly finding a conscience and suddenly taking a position that was not a deterrent. An interesting scene actually early in the film shows that he was the assistant to another man who had just become an executioner, sort of shows them in training, and the other man can't handle it. In fact, he freezes up at the last minute, and Pierpoint has to take the initiative and do the job. Um, so I think absolutely Pierpoint must have had a very cold mentality. I don't think he could have done what he done without a very, very cold mindset. There's no way he could have killed over 600 people, or even if you take the lower figure, 435, and have any sort of strong sentiments on it. And throughout the film, it's emphasized that the personal tensions with his wife towards the end when he starts to break up and his emotions start to come in. It was always the case that Albert Pierpoint stays outside when I do this job for the 1 minute or whatever it is. So that's an interesting factor. So yeah, it's a very interesting film. It's not very long, not exceptionally long, about an hour and a half. Superb acting, and I think a very powerful film. Um, and like I say, I really don't. Some people might think it's biased. I don't think it is. Um, but it is an essential film for anyone who wants to think about this subject. It is, yeah, absolutely an essential film. Now, it is true the film doesn't show any of the murders, and perhaps if it did, it would people would take a different perspective. But um, there's one scene, for example, they show a cinema reel and they show some of the scenes from Belsen and Bergen. So, I really don't think the film is saying the death penalty is a terrible thing, feel sorry for criminals. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just showing the reality of what it is. Yeah, so round it up there. Incidentally, Timothy Evans, one of the cases I mentioned, like I say, that was widely believed to be a miscarriage of justice because it's widely believed that John Christie actually committed the murders. In fact, he was hanged 3 years later for that. Most of Pierrepoint's executions took place in London, Wandsworth, Pentonville, but he basically he was contracted all over the country, including the Republic of Ireland, Germany, Austria, and yeah. Any questions? Feel free to ask. Not sure what the studio was, but like I said, released in 2005, British film, directed by Adrian Shergold, about Britain's one of Britain's last executioners. Technically, he wasn't the last. Final footnote: Albert Pierrepoint passed away in 1992 at the age of 87, and it's now been 52 years since this country had its last hangings, which were simultaneously in Manchester and Liverpool prisons, 1964. Okay, thank you for watching.